The most annoying part about this whole discussion is the fact that saying that employers hate Gen Z doesn't add up if you actually look at the reality that we're all kind of living in. But the fact that Gen Z is on track to become the largest workforce in the next 10 or 5 to 10 years, that in of itself sets a precedent that if you hate what's going to be your largest workforce, you're not going to have a lot of companies that are going to be up and running. But keeping everything simple, let's talk about that. Why is this idea that employers hate Gen Z, and where did it come from, and what are some of the truths to it and some of the misconceptions? Let's dive right in. Welcome back to the Keeping Everything Simple podcast. I'm your host and fellow student, Michael Klukas, and on this show, we boil down complicated topics into simple and actionable tips. So, the reason why I want to talk about this is I've been thinking a lot about just like what the careers look like in general for Gen Z because we want to have jobs that feel like there is a path forward. Like we have this kind of upward mobility that they can afford us, that we'll get skills and there's a kind of progression that we can go through. And each level that we gain is better than the last. And I think that's pretty reasonable because that's something that the previous generations had. And that's what we've been told. That's what we've been taught that this is the path forward to success. If you start an entry level employee at a company, you're able to work your way up and get to management. You're able to get to executiveship. And I think that's a story that we still want to believe in. We still want to think that's true. But then why do we have articles saying that employers hate Gen Z? Why do we have videos that say employers can't stand Gen Z? And I think it's because the reality doesn't match the surveys. Now, when people will say, what is the hardest generation to work with? They will say it's Gen Z. But I also don't think that is fully true because the understanding of who Gen Z is so fractured, along with this misconception about the micro generation as well. It kind of bridges that gap because Gen Z was born from 1997 to 2012. So the oldest of us are like 27, 28 years old. And the youngest millennial is like 29, 30 years old. And like that in itself, that gap makes it really blurry because then you have some of us who are still young in our careers, but not so young that we're essentially fresh off the boat. Because when employers are then getting surveys, they're like, okay, who is your most quote unquote problematic hire? Who is someone that you have to really work to train? It probably will be the younger ones in Gen Z, the younger of us in our generation who were born closer to the early 2010s. And that's just kind of a unfortunate reality for the fact that, hey, because of when we are born, we're still technically early in our career and starting off our career in a lot of in a lot of different circumstances. And so that's why I don't think the reality quite matches up because if you actually work alongside someone from Gen Z, then you usually kind of tend to realize, oh, no, there is a solid work ethic here, but there's also a recognition that, hey, this is probably not their only job. On average, we tend to have like two jobs and then a side hustle just because we're trying to afford living on our own. We're trying to afford to set ourselves up for success in the future. And that's a very common story that Gen Z and actually a lot of people anymore have two jobs. And so we're not trying to give our all to one company, one job that can't even afford us every single living standard that we want. And that as a whole, we actually deserve. Because a lot of us deserve to have a living wage and be able to, not have to worry about how much are we going to make so that way are we going to be able to keep a roof over our head. And I think that's pretty reasonable. But that also then adds that narrative of, well, Gen Z just isn't committed. Gen Z just doesn't want to work as hard. When in reality, it's like, no, we're committed. It's just that we're not going to work as hard for less. We're not going to work as hard and not be able to pay rent and buy our groceries. That's not what we signed up for. It's not what anyone wants to sign up for. That's why I think the realities in the surveys is different. But as I mentioned in the intro, like the other piece of the puzzle here is that Gen Z is going to become the largest workforce by 2030 slash 2035. So 5, 10 years, because right now we're in 2025. And so within a 5 to 10 years time span, right now it's millennials, but then it will be Gen Z. And if the attitude towards Gen Z remains the same, then it just shows that companies are going to shoot themselves in the foot by disregarding the highest and biggest labor pool that still is also the most educated labor pool in history. And the other piece of the puzzle here is that millennials went through the same exact conversation, because I remember even as a kid growing up in the Great Recession, hearing that millennials were just so entitled that they only wanted their avocado toast and to have enough PTO, so paid time off. But then the story in our world today is that companies prefer millennials for middle management. Companies prefer millennials for leadership positions. And why is that? They're further along in their careers. And it's such a stupid question for people to say, like, well, how do millennials and Gen Z differ? It really is just when were you born? That's it. And I say that's it as a broad generalization. And I'm talking about this from the perspective of the workplace, because now we also have some of the older Gen Z getting into management positions and leadership positions. And you see it pop up on TikTok, and that they are some of the more healthy and well-adjusted leaders and managers, because they recognize, hey, we know what we've been told, and we also know what's in front of us doesn't match up. So we're going to take care of our team. We're going to take care of the people around us. And that means that, yeah, we're going to do things differently than what we're probably, really, or what the company really wants us to do instead. And I think the other piece of the puzzle here, and this is the one that I think takes the cake for why we have such a discrepancy around Gen Z um, in the workplace, and why there's this idea that employers hate them. And it's because we're in the messy 20s. I think that is probably the best way to put it, which kind of is related to the last criteria of with millennials given the same treatment when they were our age and entering the workforce. Now, everyone for Gen Z that is in our 20s, it is a very messy time frame and a very messy or decade to be in, because no one's really in the same spot. And what I mean by this is the fact that you have some people in Gen Z who maybe they went to school to be a financial advisor or to be a hedge fund trader. And so they are already making like 6 figures right out the gate. And they're 23, 24. Then you have other people who are married. They're settling down at 25, 26, or, 21, 20. And then you have other people who have never been in a relationship before. You have other people who have never had a job before. Someone who's maybe hopped jobs a couple times. Maybe someone who's divorced. Maybe someone who is going back to school. There's any number of like different life stages that someone is in with their 20s, that for articles and videos to say that, hey, as a whole, Gen Z is this homogenous group that employers just hate. They can't stand. They're unmanageable. They're untrainable. They're unhirable. That is such a disservice to Gen Z as a whole, because that just adds this belief that we are one monolithic group that can't be different, that can't create change, that can't work, that can't put forward work ethic, while ignoring the fact that, again, most of us have 2 jobs and a side hustle. And so I really think that if we're going to change this conversation around employers not being able to stand Gen Z, it's going to come down to how well can we show up? How well are we showing up in our jobs, in our team meetings? How well are we showing up when we do our day-to-day work, our projects? It's really about living through the actions that we do distinctly, because when the articles, which are designed to get clicks and get reads or videos that want watches, then their whole goal is to add a little bit of outrage, add a little bit of negativity to it, because that's what gets people interested. That's what gets people hooked on that conversation, rather than looking at the reality in front of them saying, no, this is going to be the largest workforce. This is going to be the ones that are going to become our managers. And so if we believe that they're unhireable and untrainable, then we're going to have a big lack in talent within 5 years here. And I don't think that's the case. I think it really is just a matter of a misconstrued idea, this idea that we're a monolithic group versus the reality that, hey, no, we're in the messy 20s right now and we're figuring things out. And we're going to figure it out either with or without the help that companies can provide. Because if some managers let a bias towards Gen Z guide their decisions, then they're going to be losing out on a lot of talent and a lot of people who can make a outsized impact if given the chance. But yeah, so as a whole, Gen Z, we're not a monolithic group. We definitely don't lack work ethic, but we do understand that the workplace is different today than it was in the past, and we're going to use it to our advantage to the best of our ability. But with that, I hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation and just kind of diving into why employers, quote unquote, can't stand Gen Z. But keeping everything simple, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Bring that notification bell so you know every time I upload a new episode. If you're listening to us on Spotify or another podcast app of choice, make sure you leave us a 5-star rating and give us a follow. So that way you know every time that I upload a new episode, and I greatly, greatly appreciate it. Have an amazing day, you amazing people. I will see you all in the next episode. Make sure you guys go out there and do great things. Talk to you later.